I'm Jim White from the Southwest Church of Christ, as the senior minister here. And it's been a while since we've had a class like this. We've got the opportunity to, I was just reading on email about 3 classes that we'll be offering. Mine will be this one that we'll be talking about here in just a minute. I made a mistake. I had said that I would teach one on spiritual disciplines, but Brian Hofsommer is going to be teaching that class. And then there's a ladies' class that'll be going on. So something for everyone, hopefully. And I'll be doing this class every week. And I hope that you'll be a part of it. Turn it on, watch it, send in questions, whatever you want to do. We would be glad to have you be a part of that. I have entitled this class, How to Collect Your Humble Button and Other Lessons from Jesus About Humility. That's really kind of a crazy title. Really, it's just humility is what we're going to be talking about. But we're going to be talking about it from a specific point of view, or perhaps I should say a specific a scripture passage. And a frequently taught trait in the Bible is of course the one on love. You can find all kinds of passages of Scripture. When the lawyer came to Jesus and said, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Jesus said, "To love God with everything you've got, with your heart, soul, mind, and strength." And then Jesus added kind of a second one as a serendipity. He said the second one is like unto it, to love your neighbor as yourself. And so you've got that greatest commandment that comes in there. And then you read the Psalms. I've been reading the Psalms lately, and it's amazing. I've taken out my pen and ruler and underlined how many times love or God's love is in there, and it's in there over and over and over again. And it uses the term unfailing love a lot. Or if you really want to learn about love, you turn to 1 Corinthians 13 and read all those things. Now there abides faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. And so there's all kinds of things that when it mentions traits in the Bible, love is right at the top of the list. But if you were to say, what is the second one that's most spoken of, the trait would be humility. That kind of comes as a surprise in a lot of ways. I mean, who says, "Hey, look at me, and because I'm humble, therefore you ought to just look at me and emulate me." And by the way, the only person that could do that and who did do that was Jesus. In Matthew chapter 29, Jesus says, "Take my yoke and follow me, and you'll learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul." One of the things that I am just been blown away by as I've started looking at this is how many times the word humble or humility and gentleness are set side by side. Humility and gentleness are both very similar qualities, and yet they are part of a duad of traits, I guess you could say, that complement each other. You might see someone who's not gentle, and you'll say, well, they're not humble either. But if you see someone who's humble, you'll see someone who is also gentle. And it's interesting that you see these things. And it's also interesting to me that humility and rest, Jesus says, if you come to me, I am meek and humble in heart, and you will find rest in your souls. And I thought about that a lot. I thought, is there something about humility that brings rest? If we're not resting, whatever, are we really humble? I think those two are very closely tied together. James says very clearly, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. I don't know. I've seen this. I've lived a long time, and you see certain preachers, certain youth ministers go through a cycle, and I'm not. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to downgrade anybody, but it just seems that as I have experienced and seen certain speakers come along, there will be some who come and they'll speak at youth rallies or speak at any kind of gathering of the Lord's church, and they seem to be popular for a certain amount of time, and then all of a sudden the phone stops ringing, and you wonder why. I'm wondering if after a while they start saying, I am pretty good. I'm a pretty good speaker. And I think this principle holds true in that situation, that those who are humble, God will raise up. And you have to assume the opposite too. Those who aren't humble, God will bring down. Peter says essentially the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 6. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 2, it says, be completely humble and gentle. There's those two words again. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Humble and gentle. I just keep seeing those two words put together. And I just feel like they are complementary. Gentle people are humble. Humble people are gentle. And so you see that. Paul said that Jesus humbled himself, even to become obedient to death on a cross. Jesus is probably the greatest example of humility that we find. And as I said, the Psalms have a number of passages talking about love. They also have a number of passages talking about humility. One of the things I would encourage you to do is to get on our church's website and look up those words in your concordance, or pull out your concordance and do that. And look up the word humility, and it'll be, you'll be amazed at how many times you'll find it. So, how do we learn about humility? How do we learn about this trait? It's not something that comes naturally. And I'm going to give you a thought. And you might think that it's really too simple. That's just something that Jim has said, and it's just kind of a simple prospect, and I don't know that it's really that simple. Well, we can learn from something, learn about humility. Becoming humble is definitely difficult. But I think we ought to look at the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes teach us about humility. Now, before we get too far into it, I'm gonna kind of come around the back door on this, and we'll really start in on the Beatitudes next week. But I keep getting drawn in by the Beatitudes. Now, there are two sets. There's one in Luke and one in Matthew, and most people think, most of the scholars that I read think that they're the same thing. I happen to think they're two different occasions. The Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on, I believe it says, the Plain. I just see too many differences there. And you say, well, Jim, why would it be in Matthew? Why would it be in Luke when we've got these synoptic gospels? Wouldn't that be the same thing? Jesus was an itinerant preacher. He was one who was coming to teach his gospel. And it makes sense to me that he would say the same things in a number of settings. And yes, there are some similarities, but there are a lot of dissimilarities. And so I happen to think that the one in Matthew and the one in in the book of Luke are two different occasions. I may be wrong. I disagree with a lot of the scholars, and they're a whole lot smarter than I am. But it just seems to me that they are different enough. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 and 6 and 7, it's the longest discourse that we have in the Gospels or anywhere else in the Scripture of Jesus. It is a long, drawn-out sermon that he preached to his disciples, to people who were already following him. And so he's teaching them exactly what a disciple looks like. And you read all of the Sermon on the Mount, and he hits a number of subjects. And really, he's saying, listen, your heart needs to be a certain way. You can't be this way and act this way unless your heart is where it ought to be. Mike Cope wrote a book called Righteousness Inside Out. And the whole premise of the book is you've got to get the heart right. And if you get the heart right, the outside will be right. What we tend to want to do is to make the outside look good, but the inside, as Jesus said, are full of dead men's bones. But these verses, these Beatitudes contain so much. I've preached on this. I've been here at Southwest for almost 18 years now. I gave up counting how many times that I've talked or preached on this subject, 4 or 5. But I keep having this magnetism drawing me back to the Sermon on the Mount, because I feel like it's Jesus' most precious teaching. It's one of those kind of things where you feel closest to Jesus when you hear these words. And he uses a word, blessed. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. Blessed are those who are merciful. Some translations translate those as happy. I don't think that's a very good translation. Happiness, God never promises us happiness. He does promise us joy. But there are times when we're not going to be very happy. I don't like it when preachers will say, oh, are you happy? We need to be happy. Why aren't Christians happy? I think they're blessed. I have a friend of mine, when I talk to him, he's done very well in life. And I say something to him, about, how well he's done. And his answer is, well, and then when he says we, he's talking about he and his wife. He said, we've been blessed. And I think that's a good word. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. William Barclay translates it differently. He says it's almost an exclamation. It needs an exclamation mark after it. And so when he comes to the end of each one of the Beatitudes, he puts not only an exclamation mark, but he starts it with, oh, the bliss of a man. Bliss, isn't that an interesting way of putting it? Oh, the bliss of the man. Well, there are these traits, these characteristics, and these characteristics are supposed to be normal characteristics of the normal Christian life. I know that's kind of an oxymoron in a way. And yet, Jesus is saying this is the way that Christians should act. I know of a professor of Bible who meets on I think a weekly basis with a number of young people, and the whole premise is the Beatitudes, and he encourages them, okay, this week I want you to go out and live the Beatitudes. You see, they're for everyone. They're not okay, you have a certain gift in this, or you have a blessedness in this. These are traits that every Christian should have. There's no social status. There's no giftedness here. These are traits that all Christians are to have. And those who heard Jesus that day were already disciples. And he was trying to tell them, listen, this is the way that you are supposed to live. We're not just to understand these things. We're to live them. They are to be lived. Randy Harris, in his book called Living Jesus, he says the foundation is found at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. If you go there, it's in Matthew chapter 7. Starts in verse 24. He says, I guess I would get to Matthew chapter 7. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. And yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. You remember as a child, more than likely, singing the song, "The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down." I loved that song. It was great because I could not only do the actions, but the thing is, the point is, and we tend to miss the point. The point was in the very first few verses there, or the very first verse. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine. And if you look at the context of the thing, he just got done with the Sermon on the Mount. He just got done with the Beatitudes. He just got done with the rest of his sermon. He says, those who hear these words of mine and puts them into practice are like the man who built his house on a rock. And then, of course, he says about the man who built his house upon the sand. The one who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice. He's like the wise man, or the foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rains came down and the floods came up. Maybe this is why I liked it. The foolish man's house went splat. I love to do that. The foolish man was the one who heard the words of Jesus and didn't put them into practice. The very last verse of that chapter says, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. Jesus taught with authority, and he says these are the things that Christians should do. These are the ways that Christians should act. The Beatitudes have been taught from all kinds of angles. Jim Woodruff, who used to be one of the ministers, or the minister at the college church in Searcy for many years, and then he lived in Nashville for a while. He died not too long ago. But he teaches them from a relational point of view. And perhaps as we go through these, maybe at the end of our regular study, we can kind of look at these the way that Jim did. I've heard him teach that on a number of occasions. And I was so moved by him, I wrote them down on an old card of mine and put them in an old Bible, and I pull them out every once in a while and look at them. But these short verses that we have in chapter 5, these Beatitudes, are about humility. Every day, they are characteristics to be lived. I therefore This is from Ephesians chapter 4. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love. Paul says, I, a prisoner, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of your calling. And then you notice what he says, with all humility and, surprise, gentleness. The NIV doesn't use the word walk. It uses the word live, or the words live a life. To live a life in a worthy manner of your calling. I like the word walk. One of the advantages of teaching this class is being able to tell stories that I know I've told to the congregation in the past, and perhaps you remember it, but I'm hoping you don't remember it. When I was in junior high school, I lived across the street from a guy by the name of Steve Hunt. And Steve and I, there's that age of junior high where you can't drive. You have a bicycle, but if you rode a bicycle, everybody would kind of make fun of you because when you're 14, 15 years old, you just didn't ride a bike. It just wasn't what everybody did. And in the summer times, it became especially boring. And Steve and I would spend time just with each other. We both loved baseball. We were on different baseball teams. But there were times in the summer we just didn't have anything to do. And Steve, I remember, would look at me and he would say, "You want to go to Jet Store?" Now, Jet Store in West Virginia was very much like 7-Elevens or Buc-ee's or Casey's here. And this Jet Store was probably, it was more than a mile away. And I know, you hear people tell stories of their childhood and they walked uphill both ways, miles in the snow barefooted, But I remember being there as an adult with my car and driving and just measuring it, and it was over a mile one way. And Steve would look at me and he'd say, "You want to go to Jet Store?" And of course, yes, I did. And so we would walk the entire way and we would get to Jet Store, and I still remember what I would get. I'd get a Zero bar and a Coke. And by the time we got there in the summer, I'd eat that Zero bar and drink that Coke, and it was over in 5 minutes. But it's one of the memories of life that I love. Why was that? It was because Steve and I walked together. We talked about baseball. We talked about girls. That was high on our list when we were in junior high. We talked about everything. But it wasn't the trip to Jet Store that was the important thing. It wasn't the Zero bar or the Coke. It was the journey. And Paul says here, I want you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and grace. I want you to walk with Jesus. I want you to take the time to walk with him and walk with him through the difficulties, and walk with him through the wonderful times. I want you to walk with him all along the way. We sing songs, "Oh Master, let me walk with thee." Just a closer walk with God. There are all kinds of songs about that. Walking in sunlight all of my journey. And you see, it's not the stuff that happens along the way. It's the journey that you walk with Jesus. I like that. Live our lives. Walk in humility. Walk is an ordinary thing in life. But the first thing Paul mentions in that passage is humility. Humility is not a great trait in our society. It's not something that's looked upon as a top-tier quality. It wasn't in Paul's time either. But when you see a football player these days, he crosses the goal line, and everybody comes up and looks in the TV that they have, at least in professional sports, and they kind of strut and do all kinds of things. They do all kinds of dances. In basketball, if you slam dunk it, I see them pound their chest and do all kinds of things like that. That's not a trait that most of us see as something that's a strength. But in Jesus' perspective, in Jesus' mind, in the way that he approaches things, yes, it is. It's a powerful, powerful strength. Ephesians isn't the only place that we hear of humility. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, he says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." In Colossians chapter 3, he says, "I want you to put on humility." He has a whole list of things there. And by the way, guess what? Humility and gentleness are side by side in that list. And then in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 5, he says, "I want you to clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility towards one another." Remember, we said at the very beginning, there's only one person who could really say, "I'm humble," and it really count. And that was Jesus. You see, Jesus, the firstborn of all creation. I love, read Colossians 1 sometime where he says, the firstborn of the dead. In him, he's the head of the church, and in him all things hold together. I've written in my Bible, outside of him all things fall apart. I think maybe that may be what's happening to our country, is we've just eliminated Jesus as far as that's concerned, and things are falling apart. But Jesus washed his disciples' feet. He deserved to have anything like that done to him. But he got on his hands and knees and washed feet. So humility is written all over the Bible. Humility, gentleness. But the Beatitudes, they lay out the way to be humble. They say this is the way it should be. And so we'll be studying the Beatitudes over the next several weeks. And I hope you'll join me in that study. I hope that you'll read the Beatitudes, that you'll meditate on them, that you will spend some time. And it's not something that you're good at this and not good at that. Yeah, there may be some things that you struggle with. But the grace of God covers you. And I want us to learn to be humble. And as I kind of tongue-in-cheek said with my title, how to get your humble button. Humility is one of those kind of traits that, when do you ever achieve it? Can you say, "Hey, I'm a humble person"? Because once you say that, you've kind of lost it. But if you really want to know what humility is all about, you'll go to this passage in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 3 and going through verse 12. And you'll see those traits of humility. And you will do your very best to become like Jesus. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I'm looking forward to this study with you, and I hope you will join me each week. Thank you and have a good day. I hope you have a blessed day.